Welcome to today's talk, Samson Schames, Fragments of Exile, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. The event is sponsored by Ilona Oltuski in memory of Ruth Dory. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm now honored to introduce Annika Friedman, who has been part of the Jewish Museum Frankfurt team since 2021, initially as curatorial assistant and since 2022 as the curatorial project manager for the permanent exhibition in the Rothschild Palais. In addition to Samson Schames' Fragments of Exile, she most recently co-curated the 2022-23 exhibition Back into the Light, 4 women artists, their works, their paths, which detailed the lives and careers of 4 artists whose paths intersected and subsequently diverged in Frankfurt after the rise of the National Socialists. Annika Friedman received her master in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa in Israel and her bachelor at University of British Columbia in Canada. During her studies, she was the assistant curator of the art exhibition Arrivals, Departures, the Oscar Guess collection, and a project coordinator in the archives of the Hecht Museum in Haifa. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the chat. Welcome, Annika.
Thank you, Rachel. I would like to welcome you here with me this afternoon or this evening, depending where you're tuning in from. And thank you, Rachel and the Fritz Ascher Society for inviting me here. The exhibition that I'm looking forward to sharing with you throughout my presentation is one that lies near and dear to not only myself as a curator here at the Jewish Museum Frankfurt, but also to the museum itself. In order to best introduce Samson Schames and the most recent exhibition in his honor, Fragments of Exile, I would like to contextualize his importance within the scope of the museum, its history and its collections, especially for those of you who might not yet have had the chance to visit us in person. The stunning new Jewish museum, which I, as I said, wholeheartedly invite you to visit, has been under construction on the Untermain-Kai since 2015, where the new museum complex now includes a spacious extension building designed by Stab architects. The Rothschild Palais and its neighboring building have been completely refurbished and renovated for the new permanent exhibition, which spans across 3 floors. Although complicated through the pandemic, we celebrated our grand reopening in October of 2020 and have welcomed a steadily increasing wave of visitors since then. The Jewish Museum of Frankfurt, however, is actually the oldest municipal Jewish museum in Germany. On November 9, 1988, Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl opened the museum on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the November pogrom, or Kristallnacht. The pogroms that I will explain were the impetus for Schames to finalize his plans to escape Germany and into exile. Samson Schames and his life and works were the topic of the first temporary exhibition at the newly opened Jewish Museum, Frankfurt, and was exhibited between March and June 1989. Since its opening, the mission of the Jewish Museum, Frankfurt, has been to collect, study, and present the material traces of the nearly 900-year-old history and culture of the Jews of Frankfurt. The Jewish Museum of Frankfurt has numerous collections, but while concentrating on Samson Schames, I will focus on the visual arts and more specifically our Jakob Nussbaum archive. The artists in this particular collection belong to what is now referred to as the lost generation. From its inception, the Jewish Museum Frankfurt has focused on collecting works of the Frankfurt artists who belong to this category and whose artistic careers and livelihoods were altered drastically or even ended completely through their persecution, ostracism, exile, or ultimately murder. The lost generation refers to the term by art historian Rainer Zimmermann, who coined the term missing or lost generation in 1980 in order to draw a parallel with the lost generation of which Hannah Arendt and Gertrude Stein wrote in connection with the American writers of the 1920s. These artists were born at the turn of the 20th century in the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in the neighboring territories of the Russian Empire. They endured massive restrictions in their works as artists under the National Socialists and were ostracized and denounced as degenerate. For this reason, most of these artists remain unknown to a broader public. They studied with famous teachers of the time, such as Max Liebermann, Max Beckmann, Henri Matisse, and many of them had already reached the pinnacle of their artistic creativity when the Nazis seized power in 1933. But the subsequent shift in the political landscape brought about a radical rupture in artistic and cultural life. When the Nazis set up the Reichskulturkammer, or the Imperial Chamber of Art as it translates, this created obvious restrictions in all areas of culture. Art was now not only to serve the reigning, was now only allowed to serve the reigning ideology and its propaganda. The prevailing stylistic pluralism of the time was no longer desirable. Many of these artists were treated with hostility for political, racial, or religious reasons and were persecuted, driven to emigrate, or even murdered. Their artworks were removed from public collections and museums in the wake of the degenerate art campaign of 1937 and were ridiculed, destroyed, or even, in some quote-unquote luckier cases, hidden away. The past exhibitions of the Jewish Museum Frankfurt have helped rediscover many of these artists and allow their works to be seen by a larger audience. And of course, those artists who were or based in Frankfurt are of particular interest to our museum. Our most recent temporary exhibition did exactly this. Back into the light, 4 women artists, their works, their paths, brought a constellation of 4 women artists together and told their relatively unknown stories with their remaining artworks. All 4 artists are considered part of the forgotten generation, and the exhibition was a personification of the aims of the Jakob Nussbaum archive. My colleague, Dr. Eva Adlan, actually held a lecture on our exhibition last year for this very same series, so I invite you to look back and watch it if you haven't already. As I mentioned, Samson Schames was the focus of the first temporary exhibition of the newly established Jewish Museum Frankfurt back in 1989, and it was on the basis of this exhibition and the German language catalog that was published for the occasion that my research for the cabinet exhibition Fragments of Exile began. As I mentioned, the exhibition Fragments of Exile was found in the 3rd floor of our permanent exhibition in a room called Art in Exile. In our permanent exhibition, there are actually 2 cabinet exhibitions integrated within the permanent exhibition. One on the 2nd floor pertaining to contemporary Jewish artistic voices, while the other is found on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor is comprised of an extensive tour through Frankfurt history, actually beginning in the present and working its way through hundreds of years of history. 2 of the last rooms on the 3rd floor portray a variety of narratives and biographies of Frankfurt Jews after the rise of the Nazis. This cabinet exhibition space, Art in Exile, acts as a juxtaposition of the lives destroyed by the Holocaust on the other side of the hallway. In this room, we are able to exhibit works of Jewish artists who were forced into exile and who commented and reflected on the major social changes in the first half of the 20th century through their artworks. As I said, I'm trying to give you as best a feeling as possible and lead you through our exhibition. We find ourselves on the 3rd floor, adjacent to the 2 rooms which illustrate and exhibit the effects and intricacies of the persecution which arose post-1933. Here, I would also like to emphasize that the Jewish Museum Frankfurt made an explicit curatorial decision to address the topic of the Holocaust in these two rooms entitled Destroyed Lives. While the Holocaust undoubtedly plays a critical role in the rupture of Jewish life here in Frankfurt, the museum is explicitly not a Holocaust museum. Years of the Holocaust needed to be exhibited and the diverse pre-war Jewish communities honored, but as a part and contextualized within the hundreds of years of history. These are rooms that highlight exactly that, the personal biographical narratives, and allow visitors the chance to interact with information pertaining to the rupture and destruction caused by the Holocaust. As you can see in the photo on the left, this takes place in individualized biographical stations, so to speak, each one with their own selection of objects, as well as a tablet with an illustrated video. The second room is that which you see on the far end of the photo on the left, and I've included a detailed shot on the right. In this room, Frankfurt Jewish individuals persecuted by the National Socialist regime are memorialized through individual biographical panels. The panels are individualized as far as possible, and in the last year, in my capacity as the curatorial project manager of our permanent exhibition, I've actually had the honor of replacing two of these panels, where we have actually found a photo of the individual, whereas the former panel was blank. These are particularly moving moments for me, as it illustrates not only the various forms Holocaust commemoration can take, but also the fluid and ongoing nature of such an installation within our permanent exhibition. Across the hallway of the Rothschild Palais, in this picture on your left, visitors are led into the pocket cabinet exhibition where the exhibition Fragments of Exile was shown. So I'd like to say something here as to my curatorial concept to the Fragments of Exile. The title in itself is, I guess, the best starting point, or the point which I would like to start with in detailing my curatorial process, as the stories of so many emigres and immigrants is that of fragments, of ruptures, and of new beginnings. Similar to the mosaics Schames would create in Exile, his story is that of putting broken pieces together and creating beauty and meaningfulness from the fragments created from destruction. The fragmented character of Schames' story and the three major phases of his exile quickly became the structure with which I wanted to outline the visitor experience of the exhibition. The exhibition emphasized the diversity of materials that characterize Schames' oeuvre and focuses on the three phases of his life, from the beginning of his artistic career here in Frankfurt, to his work in British exile, and finally his new home in New York. And of course, here I would also like to make mention of the partner that we've had in this exhibition, the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. And I hope some of whom are watching tonight, or this afternoon, my apologies. This emphasis throughout the three phases of his exile and three phases of his life in exile was achieved in a clockwise motion around the perimeter of the room. I hope you can get a feel for this in the photos that I've included. The visitor was first greeted by the colorful backlit mosaics in the middle of the room, would then turn to the left and proceed around the room, the perimeter of the room, in a clockwise motion. In furthering the concept of fragmentation, I envisioned a fragmented version of Schames' biography. It was my mission from the onset to bring Samson Schames, that is, the man, the son, the brother, and the husband into the exhibition as much as I possibly could. While so much of his identity was in fact being an artist, it was important for me to introduce other aspects of his identity and personality. I hope I achieved this through the numerous rediscovered family photos, many candid and many showing his, what I imagine to have been, a very jovial and humorous character. The variety of biographical information was also of central importance with a combination of documents, exhibition invitations, newspaper clippings, and even excerpts from old passports. The biographical section was found in the center of the room in order to complement the artworks which hung on the outer walls. But it was very important for me that his artwork, the investment in his artwork was seen, and that his artwork was the central focus of the exhibition. So here I begin with in the beginning for Schames as well. In the late 19th century in Frankfurt, Schames was born into an Orthodox family whose roots went back to the Judengasse. At the beginning of the century, he grew up in Frankfurt-Bornheim, Zandweg number 5 to be exact, one of the centers of Jewish life here in Frankfurt. Schames, the nephew of the legendary art dealer Ludwig Schames, was attracted to art at an early age. In 1915, Schames began his artistic studies at the Offenbach School of Arts and Crafts, as a translation, where he was forced to interrupt his studies when he was conscripted for military service. As you see, he served in the German army between 1916 and 1918. After the war, he continued his study at the Frankfurt School of Arts and Crafts, which is a loose translation in English, and today is known as the renowned Städel Academy, where he there studied painting, graphics, and stage design. From 1925 onwards, he had contact with the reformed Frankfurt Art School, which developed into one of the leading German academies. Schames, who worked as a graphic artist, also designed furniture and textiles and was active as a stage designer, devoting himself intensely to painting from 1928 onwards. After the National Socialists came to power, he could only show his paintings in exhibitions of the Jewish Cultural Association or within his own studio. Here began his exile within the borders of his homeland until 1939, where he finally fled to England. While Schames' exile begins within German borders, it also represents a reoccurring theme throughout his artistic career. Schames, despite the hardships which surrounded him, continually prioritized his artwork and found a means to reinvent himself as an artist while using the limited materials at his disposal and moving within the restricted spaces he was allowed. This has to be one of my absolute favorites in the exhibition, not only for its aesthetic value, but for the stories it can tell, and simply put, the pedagogical value it added to the entire exhibition. I do hope that Mr. Charlie Scheidt is joining us this afternoon. As a close family friend of the Schames family, Mr. Scheidt generously donated the work to the museum in 2009, and we have thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to showcase it in Samson Schames' Fragments of Exile. Schames' depiction of the Opera Square, which he made in 1930, is exactly this, of the square, and not of the beautiful opera building itself, which lays directly behind our current perspective. That is to say, Schames would have actually had his back to the opera house itself in order to achieve this perspective. But why? This 1930 view would have been an ode to a different Frankfurt, his hometown, and where most streets tell a story. In the middle of central downtown, Schames would have frequented this square hundreds of times. However, there is another key topographical feature. Schames' renowned uncle, Ludwig Schames, owned an art gallery just down the street, in exactly the direction the painting alludes to. Schames not only painted the Opera Square, he is actually giving us a very personal insight into his hometown, where he not only grew up, but he also alludes to the deeply personal family connections of the Schames family here in Frankfurt. The second piece of artwork I'd like to highlight from his time here in Frankfurt is entitled Street in Autumn from 1935. Here, in this small oil painting, Schames is inarguably depicting the mood of an approaching storm. Whether Schames wanted to make reference to the political situation in 1935 remains unanswered, but it was the year of the Nuremberg laws. Although Schames couldn't have known the extent to which his career and life were to be altered, the laws and their restrictions on his everyday life and livelihood directly affected him. Schames' painting Street in Autumn was actually shown in 1936 in the Reich exhibition of Jewish artists at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. It's important for me to reiterate here that Schames was only able to display his artwork in distinctly Jewish exhibitions post-1935, explaining the newspaper clipping on the right, which was published in an exclusively Jewish newspaper in 1936. While speaking about Schames' journey and various phases of exile, I would also like to take the opportunity to speak about the unique journey of his artworks in and of themselves. When forced to make plans to escape Germany, Schames, like so many others, would have been extremely pressured to take only his most prized possessions. The frame here actually belongs to the artwork itself, as Schames extended his painting off the canvas and onto the frame itself. So not able to roll the painting, as he probably would have the Opera Square, he would have actually taken this piece as a whole. I say this because I believe it to be a testament to his artwork and the value he placed on his prized works. The Street in Autumn has actually truly traveled the world itself, across the Atlantic and back again, where we display it again in Germany almost 90 years after the newspaper article on the right. Again, I was absolutely honored that Yvonne Weissenstein, the great niece of Samson Schames, was able to attend our opening event this year and shared her memories of seeing this painting hang in her grandparents' living room with me. It's important for me to stress that I included Germany as the first stage of Schames' exile because it was exactly this. Exile for Schames began within Frankfurt, the city he was born and raised in, and his family roots trace back 500 years. He was first and foremost locked out of German society, and this is what the last oil painting strongly represents. It was one of the few works Schames was able to take with him into the next phase of his exile. The document on the left is a confirmation of the Cross of Honor he was awarded and was awarded to all World War I veterans, even as late as 1936, which is somehow especially ironic for those Jewish veterans who were in fact already experiencing extreme discrimination under the new Nuremberg laws. In addition, the identity card on the right is not in fact a passport or an official identity document, but rather the Reich Association of Jewish Cultural Associations in Germany, because Schames, as an artist, was no longer able to display or even exhibit his work publicly. Another aspect, or a fragment, if you will, of Exile were the details with which Schames had to create and finalize his plans for emigration following the brutal anti-Semitic attacks of Kristallnacht, or the November pogroms, as they're referred to in Germany. His emigration was, of course, anything but easy. Here, a document from the finance department is actually clearing him to take a small portion of his assets with him. As I mentioned in regard to the oil painting, Street in Autumn, this would have been one of the few pieces he was able to take. And as I wrote here, the rest he actually left with a friend and former classmate. And here we have his escape to England following his legal clearance document he was issued here in Germany. In 1939, on January 5th to be exact, Schames is issued a passport and legally leaves Germany. He stays with a friend in the Netherlands for 2 weeks before continuing on to England and on to London to be exact. First, his January 23rd arrival in Harwich, England, where he was first registered with the middle name Israel which German Jews were forced to add to their names by Nazi decree as of the 17th of August, 1938. With this example, I would also like to expand upon this element of Schames' exile. That is, the way his name and the way he chose to sign his artworks actually changed throughout the phases of his exile. As you will see on the document on the left, his full name is actually Siegfried Samson Israel Schames. During his time in Germany, he signed his paintings with Fritz, or F. Schames, as a shortened and as abbreviated form of the German Siegfried. After escaping Germany, he very clearly no longer signs any of his works with Fritz. Without wanting to speak for Schames myself, one can assume this was part of his identity that he left in Germany, and was part of the transformative process of his exile. After fleeing via the Netherlands in January 1939, Schames became one of 26 board members of the Free German Cultural Association in Great Britain. In March 1940, shortly before his internment at Heidenkamp, Schames managed to exhibit in his first solo show at the Brook Street Gallery, featuring a combination of Frankfurt and new works. On June 25th, 1940, Schames was interned at Heidenkamp near Liverpool. Some 5,000 German, Austrian, and Italian civilians were detained because they were officially considered, quote, enemy aliens, that is, a potential national danger in the event of a German invasion. Reports describe that isolation and sheer boredom tormented most internees, but some did in fact find solace in painting, composing, and teaching. It was common for 12 men to be packed into a house with only enough coal for a hot bath every 2 months and absolutely no furniture. Men as old as 70 slept on sacks of straw. As I said, isolation and boredom tormented many of these internees, but some did find solace in painting, and which earned the camp the nickname Heiden University. Schames, however, reported that his time in the Heiden internment camp was, and I quote, not so bad. Sorry, I'd like to use Schames' own words where possible. Schames described his time in Heiden camp as follows. Finally, I was in London. Now it was a matter of adapting to new surroundings. Yet before that was really possible, I was interned, though for a short time. It was not that bad. For many, among them, Ludwig Schames, whom I met there, it was a very interesting interlude. Room and board were taken care of, models were plentiful. After a time, we painters arranged a show where we sold not only to inmates, but also to the British officers. I drew and painted, but also made figures out of barbed wire, which I later showed on Bond Street. Since in the beginning I had no paint, I made it myself. The soot of a stove mixed with condensed milk gave me black. The juice of beets mixed with pulverized chalk, which was furnished for instructional purposes, gave me red paint. Clipped hair attached to little sticks served as brushes. All internees were released in mid-1941 as the threat of German invasion subsided and the site became a council estate, as intended in the mid-1940s. Schames, however, was released months prior to this, in October of 1940, where the next phase of his exile began. After almost 4 months, Schames was released and began serving as a firefighter in the civil defense. During this volunteer service, he witnessed the destruction of the Blitz bombings in London. During this time, he created large-scale mosaics in which he dealt with political and historical issues and illustrated the suffering he found around him. His materials were found objects from bomb-damaged London, broken glass, wires, nails, and pieces of porcelain, creating what's called detritus art. The suffering of the Jews became the theme. A monument to Hitler's infamy was the title of an exhibition that was first shown in England and later at the Karlbach Gallery in New York. The exhibition was detailed as follows. Samson Schames has wished to make a monument for Hitler. Such a plan may be a fantasy, but here in this gallery we find the notes. The savage history of 4 years told in 11 experiments of the artist's craft, 10 mosaics and a painting. The artist has not spared our feelings, but instead ripped into our imagination and our conscience with the cruel medium of charred timbers, stone, and twisted iron. A most appropriate record of tragedy with which he accuses the German leader. There are no journalistic cliches of painting because a fragment of molten glass presents the human wreck far more vividly. The sharp cutting iron shows the finality of the execution, while the leaden hands protect only the individual's anonymity, but not the vast horror of the deportation of Jews, scientists and antagonists of Hitler's way. The artist once again succeeds in making the most commonplace objects into telling of unexpected condemnation, German or any other nation's anti-Semitism. I'd like you to keep the two mosaics you see in the middle of your screen and on the right-hand side. These are two loans, the middle of which from the Leo Baeck Institute, and on the right from the Yeshiva University Museum, which were absolute focal points in the exhibition. Here is a display of how we exhibited them in the exhibition. I would like to draw your attention to one of the mosaics specifically, that is the crown of thorns on the right hand. On the right-hand side of, my apologies, on the left-hand side of the display case, the crown of thorns, made from a combination of nails, clay shards, and gypsum compound. Schames was asked about his vision for the mosaic by a journalist in 1944 in the 19th exhibition of the civil defense artists, to which he answered, "One day, as I went by a bombed building, I saw some long, rusty nails on the ground. It seemed to me that they formed a crown of thorns." My apologies, I think one slide is off. I'm going to skip forward. The portrait in mosaic form, full of emotion and incredibly expressive, represents Jesus not as the Son of God from Christian theology, but rather Jesus, the suffering Jew. Schames explains this in hindsight in a text from 1964, where he goes on to explain that the crown of thorns, he also envisioned the crown of thorns as a symbol of the burdens that we must all carry through life. And here we have the third and final stage of his exile, his immigration to New York in 1948. While he continued to work as an artist, it took several decades for him to gain recognition, and major retrospectives in Germany took place only posthumously. Schames was in New York for almost 20 years, and yet the question arises as to whether it was another stage of his exile or ultimately his new home. Although London did not offer Schames the artistic recognition he had necessarily hoped for, New York was an even greater disappointment to Schames in the beginning. Here, Schames had difficulties creating contacts with artistic circles and ultimately didn't find his way directly into the art scene. However, Schames, always adept at being able to adapt himself, created a place for himself within the art world, even if it took a little bit of a process. Schames and his wife Edith were able to make new social contacts in the Jewish community of Habonim, as well as the artist colonies of Provincetown, Cape Cod, and Northport. but he did not achieve the artistic success he experienced in the earlier phases of his career, as is the case with so many artists whose careers were cut at the pinnacle. Schames lived in New York until his death in 1967, but I'd like to refer to this, whether or not to refer to this final stage as in fact the last phase of his exile. This was perhaps one of the more challenging deliberations I had, as I obviously wanted to represent Samson Schames and his life and career in the most representative and illustrative form possible. Throughout my research, I did have the sense that perhaps Schames didn't feel completely accepted in New York, and perhaps this final stage in his migration story was in fact the most challenging for him. Perhaps for the first time in decades, he was given the chance to look back and reflect. And clues of this are found in his late memoirs that reflect on particular uncertainties and ruptures in his life throughout the last 30 years of his life, where aspects of his identity may have resurfaced for the first time in decades. For example, if we look back on the example of his mosaic Crown of Thorns, there is an anecdote with Schames' memoirs in the mid-1960s. For context, Alfred Barr Jr. was an American art historian and the first director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Accordingly, he was one of the most influential voices in the world of modern art and arguably one of the most prominent opinions. Alfred Barr Jr. liked my work, Schames says. He therefore suggests that I submit one of my mosaics, the Crown of Thorns, to the Museum of Modern Art for approval. It was rejected. He sent me a personal note, very much regretting this decision. I am convinced that the mosaic I submitted is just as good as many other works which I have seen exhibited in recent acquisitions. I am actually convinced that it is better than many others. I did not know Alfred Barr. There were no connections. Now, in 1964, I can only add that this rejection embittered me. Up to that time, I had still faced life optimistically. Now I was deeply hurt. But I now also notice many injustices being committed with my kin. Although Schames found success and a sense of community in New York, it's evident that this last transition was incredibly straining on Schames' artistic career and perhaps his confidence in his own work. He states himself he was embittered by this rejection and found it challenging to remain optimistic. That said, he did find comfort in the Jewish communities of New York. Here are two colorful and luminous examples of stained glass mosaics from our collection here at the Jewish Museum of Frankfurt. Schames created these for an exhibition at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York in the winter of 1956-1957, entitled Modern Art for Synagogue and Homes. As I mentioned, New York was not only another phase in Schames' multifaceted story of migration, but also a time for him to revisit his past. Here, he pays an ode to his earlier mosaic works, for which he used the rubble of bombed London. But these fragments, however, are of his own making. These are the only known examples of Schames revisiting the medium of mosaics he used after leaving England, making it all the more striking that he chose to depict two iconic, very well recognized Jewish holidays, namely Hanukkah on the left and Rosh Hashanah, as well as Yom Kippur on the right with the blowing of the shofar. Schames had always been highly influenced by his surroundings, and New York was no different. He enjoyed long walks through the different boroughs of New York, and again, we see his artistic style change based on the active scenes of New York. However, in the 1960s, Schames was also reflecting on earlier moments and fragments of his life. For example, this excerpt from his later life memoirs, which refer to the moment he learned of the fate of his mother and sister. He says, "Recording is sometimes very difficult. What has happened lies so far back and is yet so close. Today is also the yesterday of long ago. It is a wild pell-mell of times and periods. The mind cannot take hold of the remembrances, and what has just been is blotted out. It is a kind of vertigo. The conduits of the brain have become entangled. Short circuits alternate with light flashing up from a vacuum. The spells of dizziness occur in the midst of conversations, and I am overcome by one now, as this very moment. I have just received a letter, a report from Germany. It has been ascertained that my mother was deported to Theresienstadt in September of 1942, and she died there in February of 1943. The thought tape is running in reverse. It is a reel of a projector. The pictures are not clear. Suddenly they come to a halt, and I see my mother in a gloomy room, some sort of sack lying there on the floor, a picture which I often had before me. Now she stands there. My wife says, coffee is boiling. The reel races on, jerks, and comes to a standstill. I turn the boiler off and go on reading. My sister vanished and has never been heard of. No way of ascertaining where and when she died. It must have been prior to 1942 that she was separated from my mother. Was she carried off to a labor camp, to the officers' quarters of a Nazi camp? Did she have to serve the troops? Did she have to suffer all the Nazi tortures? She was 30 at the time, blonde, good-looking, a plain, good human being. I hope death reached out for her soon, lest she go through all this misery. I was then in England. It was too late for her to get out. As we are only a few weeks away from what would have been Shames's 125th birthday, I wanted to end with this quotation which so eloquently illustrates the fragmented memories and experiences of so many immigrants. In addition, it was a priority of mine to include as many personal aspects of Schames into the exhibition itself, whether it be his own handwriting for the title, the candid personal snapshots, or where possible, his own words and quotations. Schames used his art in all its varied mediums to express the transformation of his identity, always influenced and affected by his surrounding environments. It was my goal to bring this strength to the forefront and allow visitors the chance to experience the multifaceted fragments of not only his exile, but also ultimately the life he led. And with that, I'd also like to wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. I couldn't miss the opportunity to wish you all a happy Hanukkah using one of Shames's beautiful motifs.
Thank you so much, Annika Friedman. This was a very full and a beautiful lecture. And of course, there are lots of questions, but I want to start actually with a comment by William Weitzner from the Leo Baeck Institute, who thanks you for recognizing the cooperation of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York and Charlie Scheid, and says that they were very much impressed by your exhibition in Frankfurt and that they hope to bring the exhibition to New York as well. So in that respect, they are looking for other not known artworks by Schames to find them in the United States. Please send me an email. I will forward it to the Leo Baeck Institute, and so they can realize an exhibition. And so if you want to be involved there, I'm happy to connect you to William Weitzer. So wanted to say that first before we go into Schames. And the first question I want to ask you: what were the highlights of your work about Samson Schames? You seem to have gotten very deep into the research. So, what were the highlights?
The highlights for me, speaking as a curator, the highlights for me are absolutely always when I get to make personal connections with the research topic. And for me, this was very specifically meeting actually some of Shames's family members. I didn't mention Schames himself didn't have children, And so in the beginning, I quite naively thought maybe I wouldn't have the chance to meet so many family members. I thought it might be a bit of detective work. But at the very beginning of my research process, over 2 years ago now, in combination with the Leo Baeck Institute, we held an event, and it seemed to work. It seemed to create a waterfall of information and contacts of family members. And I could have never imagined, as a curator, as a historian, you can't imagine a better outcome, being able to connect with your research topic so personally. And this has always been my largest motivation when I become this personally connected to my research topic. It's definitely been the absolute highlight for me, being able to welcome multiple members of Schames' family here in Frankfurt and show them the exhibition myself, and hear their stories and their family anecdotes. For example, of the street in autumn once being hung in Yvonne Weissenstein's grandparents' living room. This to me is an absolute dream as a historian. It doesn't get any better than stories like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So do you have any knowledge, did you find out how the last name Schames, where that came from? I mean, it's not a German Jewish name, that's for sure. The Schames is usually in Yiddish or Hebrew refers to the caretaker of a synagogue. So do you have any knowledge of where the name came from, where the family came from before they were in Germany?
I do know. I focused more or less on their time, the hundreds of years of the Schames line here in Frankfurt. I do know that it is quite rare that the name stuck. I know this not only from my own family history, but from multiple other research projects. The name is usually changed along the ways, whether that's every 100 years, every generation. There are usually quite a few changes, but Schames, which would have originated from, like you said, the word shamash, which is especially relevant during Hanukkah. The name has incredibly stayed very much the same. And this, I think, I couldn't help but incorporate it also into the idea of what the various phases of his exile did to his identity. I would never dare to speak for him, but this idea that he very much embraced his first very German Siegfried, he shortened it to Fritz, and that's how he signed his works during his time in Frankfurt. They were, although he came from a very Orthodox family, Schames was a very, very integrated, proud member of German society. Again, I mean, he was conscripted and served 2 years in the German army, and the irony of ironies, he was given his decoration in 1936 when he was already cut out of German society. So I say this because his name, Israel, he was forced to take on the name Israel, later dropped it. The name and the journey that his name has taken, and his family name staying the same, is, for me, an absolutely critical point and portion of his story and the way it developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see that. I think especially, yes, in the Jewish history in general, but also especially in the story of refugees who have to adjust to different cultural communities, to different cultural contexts, and then especially the immigration to the United States. A lot of people changed their name, or the name was changed by immigration officers. Like if I think of the Russian names, the Polish names, very often the immigration officer would just change the name because it was too complicated, whatever. So, but it didn't happen. Do you think that helped him carry on his career from country to country, or what is do you see his career more as fractured?
I see his career as fractured only because I took the lead from him and the way he refers to his struggles. Again, I would never want to put words in his mouth. Based on what I've read, I do think that he found a sort of strength from being able to take his name with him, and like I mentioned, this very strong name, and not changing it in any way, shape, or form. He came first of all to England and was himself. And in New York as well, unabashedly himself in his most genuine form as an immigrant. And on the American documents, he's completely dropped Siegfried. And I think this is also a very telling sign in unpublished memoirs that I found. He also discloses the fact that he was offered a position in Germany and flat out refused. It wasn't an option for him to come back. I do know that they visited Germany, but it was an absolute flat out refusal. He couldn't envision himself back in Germany. Again, Germany, the place where his family roots go back hundreds and hundreds of years, that was for him an absolute rupture, and there was no way of going back. He flat out refused and dropped the name Siegfried. I do know that certain family members were still allowed to call him Fritz in America. But I attribute this more to the fact that publicly he didn't want to be connected with Germany, or officially, I'll say. But of course, that will have forever been part of his identity. And of course, how he chose to allow his little nieces and nephews to refer to him is completely a family matter.
Yeah. Masha is asking about the things that he was able to take with him as he left Germany. Are there any records known to you where he talks about the decision process, which to take with him and what to leave, and the things that he left? Was he able to retrieve them? What's the story there? Or what do you know of the story?
What I know of the story is also fragmented. I'm not saying this to fit into my the title. It is unfortunately the case, and I have to say, even throughout the process of as the exhibition stood, I also continued to receive small bits of information that I hadn't found before. So it's a fluid process, and I think every curator has to be transparent in saying that it's a process. I do know that he was able to take very little with him. He left as I was leading groups through the exhibition. I often got the comment, he got out right in time. You could say that, but also I need to reiterate how difficult it would have been to emigrate at any point in time. As I showed, the finance department had an absolute chokehold on his finances. Emigrating and leaving your home country and starting anew in a foreign land is difficult in the best of times, not to mention without job security, without economic security, and then in what would then become a war that would affect him in England as well. He was interned in England as a German, not as a Jew, as a German. So he wasn't, leaving Germany was not easy for him. And I did make a point of telling groups that would ask me that it was in no way, shape, or form easy, because he got out, quote, in the nick of time. He wasn't able to take very much with him. Unfortunately, and this is what I would still like to follow up on, I haven't found a record of the friend whom he said he left works with. I haven't found, that's a bit of a lead that I would still like to follow. I do know that he had offered a few friends and a few colleagues to take more works. And in these unpublished memoirs, a few of his friends said, no, we won't take any more. You'll be back. We're not hyenas, was the word that they used. They didn't want to feel like they were vultures picking, whatever they could. I do know that he was able to take some paperworks because he could lay them flat and take them with. I was under the assumption that the few oil works that we have from his time in Frankfurt, including the Opera Square, would have been rolled. But the reason I place such a focus on the street in autumn is because the frame is original, which is extremely rare as far as provenance research goes. The fact that the frame belongs to the artwork. The frame is part of the object, and he would have transported that across the continent to take it to safety in England, which I find absolutely incredible. And again, a testament to how he valued his artwork and how he saw that as his livelihood.
Yeah, but also I think because it's a Frankfurt motif, in a sense, he was taking a little bit of home with him, right? And
I think so too.
And it was hanging at the grandparents' house, and so it was a part of home that he probably decided to take with him. Sharon is asking, how did Schames interact with the abstract expressionists who were sweeping the art world? Perhaps their domination accounts for the rather poor reception that Schames endured. I'm not sure about the poor reception, because I feel it depends when, because I feel in Frankfurt he was very well received and very well on his way to a successful career. Or what do you?
This is how I interpret it as well. I do think in many ways he has quite a stereotypical timeline as far as as a member of this forgotten generation, in that he was in his 40s, at the height of his career. He was very well received in Frankfurt, but even before as I mentioned, the first stage of his exile was in fact here in Germany, in Frankfurt. He was an extremely successful artist, working in graphic design, extremely influenced by the Bauhaus School of Design, stage design, graphic design. And then that world, the door was slammed in his face as of 1935. Yes, he stayed in Germany for another few years. Of course, there are a lot of layers to a decision like that. And of course, we're viewing everything with the benefit of hindsight. But I do know that it seems very much from my research that he was at the pinnacle of his career, and he not only experienced a rupture or a setback, it was very much a cut, and he did his absolute best to take that success with him in London. I feel like he did have more success in London. He had a niche with his mosaics, and even the works that he was able to create in Heidenkamp. And his time in New York, he did feel at home. It was again, perhaps it had less to do with the fact that it was New York and more to do with the fact that it was the third time that Samson Schames, as a man and as an artist, was forced to reinvent himself and to recreate and reestablish his own livelihood. I think it's something very few of us will ever be able to understand.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Do you know how he made a living in New York?
I know that he refers to his time in the suburbs. I wish I could refer to the names offhand, but the suburbs of New York, he would go in the summers, and he does make mention of the fact that he was able to sell his artwork amongst different artistic groups, and he was able to finance his life in New York from the proceeds of his summer business, so to speak. So that's my indication that he was in fact able to live off of his earnings as an artist, and make a life for himself in New York in the 50s and the 60s.
So not so bad after all in terms of an artistic career, to make it in New York and to finance your life in New York is not bad at all. It's a success in itself, I would say.
Yes, I think so too.
So Yvonne Weisenstein writes, we called him Uncle Marla, but my mom, his cousin, called him Fritz, but his wife Edith always said Samson. So apparently all his diverse first names lived on in the family, which is nice.
I think this is such a testament to how he came across different family members, and the different parts of his identity shone through in different moments and different relationships. I think there's no better testament to the layers of what it is to be an immigrant, to me anyway.
Right.
So thank you for sharing, Yvonne.
So, and Charlie Scheid says, and I think we need to conclude, the time flew like always. Charlie Scheid says, thank you, Annika, for your wonderful and thorough talk. I want to also say that myself. And he mentions that there are several mosaics from the Blitz which are missing, and we would very, very much appreciate to have any information about their whereabouts. So this is a big shout out to our audience and beyond, to please contact us if there's any knowledge about one of the mosaics that are not in the Jewish Museum Frankfurt, not in the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, or in the Yeshiva University Museum in New York. So we would very, very much appreciate it, so that we can bring, or that you can bring, or that Samson Schames can be admired in New York in the near future. And I was actually hoping, Annika, to tell everyone, you can go please see the exhibition in Frankfurt. It was planned to be open until the middle of January. So please, I guess, would you like to say what changed? Or
I can say something quickly. I didn't necessarily want to start my presentation this way, so thank you for the opportunity. I wouldn't dare mislead anybody. The exhibition, although it was a little bit sad and hard for me to take it down, we had in fact extended the time already. It was originally meant to close in September, so I was grateful to keep it open a little bit longer. And we made the decision here at the museum in Jewish Museum of Frankfurt to use the space. As I had mentioned, it's a cabinet exhibition which shows installations in rotation. We made the decision to show a video installation pertaining to the current situation in Israel. So as that was extremely time pressing, we had to make the quick decision to exchange and to change the exhibitions out. But I was very grateful to have that the Fragments of Exile was as well visited as it was, and I was able to do multiple digital tours. And as I said, the true highlight for me was being able to welcome our partners from the Leo Baeck Institute and Charlie Scheid, as well as I said, his family members. That was a true highlight for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Annika. And I want to conclude with Ilona Oltuski, who has sponsored this event, who thanks us very much. It was most informing, and I enjoyed especially the discussion later. It was very meaningful for me to connect my passion for the arts with the memory of my mom, Ruth Jory, and our life in Frankfurt. So thank you so much.